Hello and welcome to This Week in Fantasy LCS, where we look at projected results for Week 4, highlight some sleeper picks, and look at some surprise performances from last week. First, let's look at the model I used to project the upcoming fantasy results. This model is based on two things: the player's performance this split and a matchup factor for their upcoming week. To illustrate this model, let's look at LMQ's top laner Ackerman. In the first 3 weeks, he averaged 20 points per game. This week, LMQ faces EG and Curse. Top laners playing against EG get 0.5% below average points, however top laners playing against Curse get 10.6% above average, leading to a matchup factor of 10.1%. Taking into account his points per game and his matchup factor, he's expected to earn 42 total points this week. Looking at the results of Week 3, LMQ dominated. Ackerman scored 20 points above the next closest person and was almost the #1 netting fantasy player of the week, only behind his teammate Xiao. We projected last week that LMQ would have a huge week, and they really did. The real big surprise though was Complexity, who had a big week. In their win over Curse, Westeros scored 26 points, the most for a top lane in a single game last week with exception of Ackerman's games. For this week though, LMQ is looking at another good week since they have pretty easy matchups versus EG and Curse. Also, Millennium and Kevin are looking to have a strong week because they're against Super Hot Crew, who despite their season record gives up 16.6% additional points for top lane, and Gambit, who's the easiest matchup in EU. Also, while Dyrus is high rated here, I'd be careful, as TSM has been slumping hard in the past 2 weeks. My sleeper pick would be Seraph, who's against Complexity and EG. On to Jungle, where we saw another LMQ player topping the charts. However, under him is Sven Skaren, who had a breakout fantasy week. Airwalks also had a pretty strong week, as predicted in the last episode, while surprisingly Crumbs was in last place despite Dig's 1-1 record last week. Looking at the Week 4 predictions, we see Shook right up near the top with No Name. Alliance has a pretty easy week against Gambit and Fnatic. Also, while Airwalks has been a surprise success in the jungle, this week he's not predicted to do very well, so I don't advise picking him up if you missed his last 2 great weeks. One thing to keep in mind for junglers is the rumors about Helios. While I don't predict that EG will suddenly become a much better team, I would drop Snoopy if you haven't dropped him already, and maybe pick up Helios for the long term. My sleeper pick is Impaler, who's going against Millennium and Roccat and might be available in those 4- and 6-man leagues. The overall fantasy points leader last week was Xiao, who got a huge 62 points. Nick also had a surprisingly big week with 40.66 points, while historically he's been a very weak pick fantasy-wise. For the projected picks, Kerp is near the top yet again. Millennium has seemed to struggle recently, but Kerp keeps putting up points, and while I don't think he'll be #1 mid this upcoming week, he's probably worth a starting spot. My sleeper pick would be Jez's, who's been consistently underrated in the discussion of European mid laners. At the top of Week 3 for AD carries, we saw a break in the LMQ trend, with Woolite being #1. This is absolutely absurd because Copenhagen Wolves lost both of their games this past week, yet he is the #1 grossing player in AD carries. Typically, winning AD carries score 2 times more than losing AD carries, but Woolite continues to break that trend. The other surprise was Altec, who's 3rd place. In EG's 1 win last week, he racked up a ton of points. Looking at projected rankings though, we see both Altec and Woolite a bit further down the list as they have tough matchups. Tabs is projected to be the #1 AD carry, and I can see that, as they have easy matchups this week. My sleeper pick would be Mr. Rallies, who's been a high point scorer on Super Hot Crew, the underrated EU team currently in 3rd place. One strong performance worth highlighting last week was Yellowstar. Most of the other Fnatic members didn't place very high in their roles, but Yellowstar was 3rd, slightly behind N-rated. And while there seems to be a consensus that Aphromoo is the best support in NA, his point total is somewhat weak, landing behind Bubba and Crepo. This week, however, Aphromoo is expected to get solid points since they are playing against weaker opponents, and is tied with Moore in the projected picks. One pick on this list I would be weary about is Glebe, who's near the top but I am skeptical of his performance. My sleeper pick is Kiwi Kid, who's playing against a slumping Curse and the shaky Cloud9. Last week, despite LMQ crushing most of the player sections, Alliance topped the charts in team points due to their long drawn-out games in comparison to LMQ's stomps. Objectives are all that matters for team scoring, so CLG is actually near the top despite all of their players having low points as well. A team's playstyle is important to factor in rather than just how strong the team is. With this in mind, we look at this week's projections, where Dignitas is actually projected 1st place. Dig so far has the second highest points per game out of all the teams, only slightly behind the Lions. My sleeper team would be Super Hot Crew, who has flown under the radar this split and is showing a strong performance so far. If you want to take a closer look at the tables, check out the article. Good luck with your picks and see you next week.